So one food source might lead to worse survival, or one direction or one decision might lead to worse reproductive success. And then the way you determine if a trap is there is whether or not the thing the animal prefers should be the come with the worst fitness rewards, so the worst survival or reproductive success. So here's a couple of just examples that don't involve insects. One is with hawksbill sea turtles. They tend to climb these beaches, and they tend to prefer their eggs very close, very high up on the water line, so right next to the vegetation. And that makes sense because that keeps them out of the water, and it's also where predators are least likely to detect them, historically at least. But different novel predators have been introduced, like these mongoose. And mongoose, actually, they're a new predator, and they like to forage right along the vegetation line on the high tide line. So now the eggs that the turtles are laying are exactly in the place where the mongoose are doing most of their searching. So these edge nesting sites have become an evolutionary trap for the sea turtles. Here's another example that does involve insects. In most of the northern country of Northern Europe, and this probably happens in North America too, when we're doing forestry activities, we cut down timber and we put the timber in large piles. Well, bark beetles are attracted to the smell of decaying wood, and they will come to these wood piles in huge numbers and lay their eggs on those wood piles, because that's where they can reproduce. But of course, wood piles eventually end up going to the sawmill, and their eggs are destroyed there. So this actually attracts huge number of insects to these piles, and then their young are destroyed. So you can see that the idea is they're attracted to do things that reduce their survival and reproductive success. And this can occur in like any type of behavioral context, right? Whether humans or any type of animal, we're making lots of decisions all the time. That can be what kind of food should we eat, what kind of mate should we choose, when should we go to sleep, or where should we sleep, and can I trust this person? So there's all kinds of decisions we're making, and so far the evidence shows us that evolutionary traps happen in all of these contexts. They happen in choosing a place to live, what to eat, how to get from one place to another, where to lay your eggs, who to choose and who to mate with, and even things like financial planning. So any kind of behavior can cause a trap, and it looks like every type of species that's ever been tested seems like it's susceptible to being trapped. So this is a broad phenomenon that can happen in any behavior in any type of organism, maybe at least animals. And what we're starting to see, though, is that it's also a conservation problem, that huge numbers of endangered species are actually being caught in evolutionary traps, and that those traps are contributing to their endangerment. This lizard in the middle, you can see this fringe-tailed lizard actually had only 2 populations left in Israel, and one of them went extinct because of an evolutionary trap. So there's only 1 population left. So the kind of evolutionary traps that I study most often in my research are a result of a thing called polarized light pollution. And this is only been defined since about 2009 in this paper here. And they primarily infect aquatic insects. So I'm going to talk about that for the rest of the time here. So there's this type of light, it's called polarized light. So I want to tell you what that is. You might have taken physics at some point, and you might remember that light is both a particle and a wave. And if you think about light as a wave, it's vibrating in an electrical field and a magnetic field, kind of in these little waves. And if you just focus on the electrical field there, that green vibration, it's sort of vibrating up and down in this case, like kind of vertically. And that's just one photon kind of going into the screen there, kind of traveling. But anytime you're looking, your eye is constantly absorbing billions and billions of photons every second, and they're vibrating in all kinds of different directions. And so that little diagram on the bottom left that says unpolarized, that's supposed to be kind of giving you the idea that those photons, some of them are in any one sample of light, that you might see, some of the photons are vibrating up and down, and some of them left and right, and some of them at all these other different angles. But light can get forced to vibrate in just some angles. It might start getting vibrating more, or become in the horizontal angle, so less in the vertical, and we might call that partially polarized. And if every single photon is vibrating exactly horizontally or left and right relative to our eye, that's when we call that 100% horizontally polarized. So polarization is about the direction of the vibration of light, and it has nothing to do with the brightness or the color of light. And it's something that humans can see, but you have to trick your eye to do it. So it's something we kind of generally ignore. There's two sources of polarized light on Earth, naturally at least. And the first one is the sky. And so you can't really see this very easily, but basically if light is coming from the sun is entirely unpolarized. But when it goes through the atmosphere and hits like a particle of vapor or a piece of dust or something, it will bounce off in some direction. And if it bounces off at exactly a 90-degree direction, it will be polarized vertically. And so that means that when you look, if the sun is on the horizon in the morning, for example, that means that if you look straight up, there's actually, straight up is actually 90 degrees from the sun. And so that means that straight up above you, there's sort of a stripe of polarized light in the sky. And this picture is trying to show you a kind of stripe of polarized light across the sky when the sun is on the horizon on the right there. But the more important one that I want you to pay attention to is a pattern that happens on the ground. And that is when light bounces off shiny thing, flat, smooth things. So this is light from the sun that's unpolarized and bouncing off the surface of the water and getting kind of horizontally polarized. This is the primary #1 source of polarized light on Earth, our water bodies. And you can see this, you might have some sunglasses, and if you have polarized sunglasses, those sunglasses are designed to block horizontally polarized light. So they're designed to block the polarized light off the water because it's a left-right light, and it only lets in light vibrating up and down or vertically. And so if you look at a pond, like on the left there with some fish in it, for example, with your naked eye, you will just see all this glare and this kind of shiny reflections off the surface. But if you put on your sunglasses, it will cut out all of that horizontally polarized light, and you will see straight down into the water, and you'll see the fish. So it's that shininess off the water that is the horizontally polarized light, and it's a unique characteristic of water. And a lot of animals need to find water, and a lot of animals have evolved the ability to see polarized light. These are polarization sensitive animals. There's all kinds. Some of them are terrestrial insects, some of them are animals, some of them live underwater. But a good number of these animals are able to have evolved the ability to see polarized light because they need to find water. And you can test this kind of thing with really simple experimental systems. So these are just plastic trays of various colors, and they've been filled with like salad oil, like vegetable oil. And what you can see there at the top row is just what it looks like to our eyes. And on the bottom row, you can use some special photography to see what it looks, to kind of measure the fraction of light that's being polarized. So in all the photos I'm going to show you from now on, black pixels mean very strongly polarized light, like 100% polarized light. White pixels mean 0% polarized light, and anything in between is some fraction. And what you see in this picture is that this black tray is essentially polarizing about 100% of the light that's bouncing off it. I could give you some more detailed explanation of how that works, but the short version is that all of the light bouncing off the surface in all of these trays is 100% polarized. But the light bouncing into the tray and hitting the back of the tray and then coming back through the oil and leaving the surface of the oil again and coming to your eye, that light can be polarized or not polarized. And the black tray is essentially absorbing all the light that goes into the oil and only letting you see the light that's reflecting off of it. And that's why it's such a good polarizer. And so, you can put these kinds of trays out by water bodies where aquatic insects are very active and looking for water to lay their eggs. And what happens is, they'll approach these ponds of oil, and they'll touch down on them to lay their eggs. And when they do, of course, they'll get stuck because oil has no surface tension. And so they'll just sink into the oil. And so it becomes a really good study system for testing the relative attraction of aquatic insects to these surfaces. And so here's a basic result you might see of that kind of system. You'll see that this is the number of mayflies and the number of biting tabanid flies and the number of dragonflies that were found in each of these kinds of traps. And what you see is that you find the most of these insects in the darker colored traps. In fact, they capture the vast majority of the insects. And so what this kind of tells you is that both the imagery and the attraction here, this is happening because polarized light is like the most reliable way to find water. You can measure the color of water or all kinds of things, and polarized light is the most reliable indication of a water body. So it's a really good way for insects to find it. And so every aquatic insect that's ever been found and tested can see polarized light and uses it to find water. And you can also see that higher degrees of polarized light are more attractive to these insects. So they just have a rule in their mind that says, go to the more strongly polarized light. And what I also want you to notice is that this is interesting because natural water bodies really don't polarize more than about 80% of the light that bounces off them. But what I showed you in the last image was that those black trays are polarizing about 100%. So that's a very new thing in the history of the Earth. There's no natural object that will polarize that much light. And so we can create objects that polarize light in ways that insects have never seen throughout their evolutionary history. And what we see is that there's all kinds of artificial sources of polarized light in the world, and the insects are very strongly attracted to them. This is from the 1992 explosions of oil in the Kuwait desert. Giant lakes of oil spilled into the desert. And what you saw was there's all these giant bands of insects in the desert that were attracted to them. They would try to land on the oil because they thought it was water. And there's some imagery on the left showing you some crude oil, solid oil, and water in some different trays, and kind of showing you that this crude oil is just extremely strongly polarizing. So this was all kinds of dragonflies and mayflies and diving beetles and things. Gravestones are strong polarizers of light. And this is a dragonfly that decided to set up a territory on this gravestone. It thinks that this is a small pond, and the only other habitat requirement that dragonflies have in many cases are they need a source of polarized light, and they need a perch. And those are their main habitat requirements. So this dragonfly has a territory here. Dark cars will also polarize light very strongly. In fact, there's a kind of general rule that in the visible range, at least, darker colored smooth objects are stronger polarizers of light, and lighter colored objects are weaker ones. And so that you can see that in these colors of cars. The red car is a stronger polarizer of red, green, and blue light, or at least green and blue light, whereas the white car is really not polarizing light in any of these wavelengths. And because of that, here's a dragonfly that's turned a Honda into a territory. This is a car. It thinks this car is a pond. It stayed there for like months at a time. And buildings too. Like this is the biology building at the University of Jatvos in Hungary, right next to the Danube River. And you can see that glass building there. That's the biology building. And you can see it's got like darker colored panels and lighter colored panels on it, and they're shiny glass. And what you can see here is that the darker colored panels are stronger sources of polarized light. And what happens is every year these caddisflies, these hydropsychid caddisflies will emerge from the river in the billions. There's billions of them. And even though the river is right there and it's a strong source of polarized light, the building is more attractive to them. And so they will descend on this building by the billions and try to lay their eggs on it. That's two of them mating on the side of the building, and they'll lay their eggs on the building. And it doesn't even matter that the building is vertical and the river is horizontal. It doesn't matter. They will still be more attracted to this building. And what happens is they lay their eggs on it and then they die. So this leads to complete reproductive failure and complete adult mortality. And even an asphalt road attracts all kinds of insects to lay their eggs on it too, because they think here's a car under a nightlight. So you can see that these mayflies here are not only attracted to the polarized light coming off the asphalt and the car and the windows, but this is all happening at night, even just so there's no sun even. It's just these night lighting reflecting off the objects. So this is kind of all the history up to about a few years ago, sort of a summary of what's happening with aquatic insects and polarized light. And all that has happened within the kind of visible range, so light that humans can see. But there's light that humans can't see, that most insects can, and that's in the ultraviolet range. So that's in this area here down below 400 nanometers. That's what we call the ultraviolet range, and you can see here this is a model of a tetrachromatic insect, and the range of frequencies of light that those 4 types of pigment cells in its eye can see, and one of them is specialized in seeing just ultraviolet light. And that's not all insects can see that, but most. And so it may be that ultraviolet light could be polarized by natural or even artificial objects, and that this could be another channel in which evolutionary traps could happen, and in which insects could naturally locate water bodies. So I think one of the first questions we ask is does natural and artificial objects polarize light in the ultraviolet range? So this is a paper that's about to go out for review, and we wanted to know, like, so this is a kind of an image, and here you can see in the top row are all these objects, like water with a muddy base and water with a light kind of gravelly base, cars that are dark and light, a metal building that's kind of lighter colored, some solar panels of 2 different kinds, and then here's a glass building. I'm actually sitting right in this building right now, that little window there. And then you can see in the middle range the things we normally see in the polarized light from the visible range. So water with a dark substrate will polarize a lot of light, but not the light substrate. The dark car body will polarize light, and some of the interior of this car, but not. And then in this car, which has a back kind of, it's more of a truck, you can see that the window does not go out to the back, so it's kind of a lot of dark background in there, and that'll polarize light. And the solar panels a little bit, and the sky and the windows on this building. And what you can see here in the bottom row, this is the new information, the ultraviolet light. And I hope that you can see that, wow, it's kind of shocking how strongly the ultraviolet light is getting polarized, and in new ways. You can see that both light and dark water bodies are polarizing UV. And both light and dark car bodies are polarizing UV. And in particular, solar panels, this kind on the left is called a thin film solar panel, and it is very strong, a good absorber of ultraviolet light, and so it's also a good polarizer of ultraviolet light. What was kind of surprising, though, is glass. These glass on these 2 cars and on this building is just an incredibly good polarizer in ultraviolet. And that's because glass in general absorbs ultraviolet light very strongly. So what we learned here from this picture, from these images, is that a new rule. So it's not just, while in the visible range of light, dark shiny objects are the stronger polarizers of light. It looks like in the ultraviolet range, white objects can also polarize light, but they only do it in the UV. We also learned that windows are an exceptionally good polarizer, so that's new information that we just learned. And this can also happen at night. So this is some of the same objects, and they're underneath a nightlight that has an ultraviolet component. And many do. Metal halide and mercury vapor lights, and even LEDs or light emitting diodes. Many of those have some component of ultraviolet. And what you can see in the middle row here is that this is the hood of the hood of my car. The light is polarizing off the surface of it. This is the window, and it's an even stronger polarizer of light in the visible and in the ultraviolet range. And here's a solar panel. I mean, solar panels maybe aren't necessarily going to get that lit up at night, but they could, and that will happen. So this ultraviolet polarized light pollution can happen at the daytime, and it can happen at night. And so the question then becomes like, well, are insects attracted to it? And could this also create evolutionary traps? And so we've done some experiments. The first one we did here just in New York. And this is the study design for it that I won't explain all the way, but what you're kind of trying to look at is these two arrows. These are all different lamps, and the lamps are some of them have the black regular visible range lamps, and some of them have ultraviolet lamps. And some of them are being polarized by bouncing off kind of artificial water bodies that are white or dark. And those will polarize visible versus ultraviolet range light differently. But I just want you to focus on these two arrows. These two arrows represent the treatments that have ultraviolet polarized light in them, the kind of little purple oval. And so what we predict is that if there's an aquatic insect that's attracted only to those two, that would be an indication that it's only attracted to ultraviolet polarized light. And we tested about 8 or 9 different families of insects here in New York, and these are some of the results, and you see all kinds of different results. Some that are just attracted to ultraviolet light in general, some that are attracted to polarized light in general. But it was this group here, the leptocerid caddisflies, that were only attracted to ultraviolet polarized light. So at least one species of aquatic insect only uses ultraviolet polarized light, and maybe that means it's rare, but we don't know. And so what we can learn from this experiment is that at least some nocturnally active insects can use ultraviolet polarized light to locate water. And because we did this experiment with artificial lamps and artificial lights, this means that they're also susceptible to evolutionary traps created by ultraviolet polarized light. So that means that we could fool them with our light pollution and make them lay eggs on man-made surfaces of any kind. So this is the recent work that I've done, kind of helping assist Angelica in her master's research and working with Alex in his supporting that. So I play a small role in this research, and so it's not mine. It's really Angelica's, and this was done in Mexico City at this research site and of natural ponds at 3 locations, and Angelica created these trays that she let the dragonflies associate with, and they had different visual properties. One of them on the left there that was this sort of picture up here I'm looking at, and they're both painted green, and one of them has a metal bottom to it and no water in it. That was this one over here, and this one has water. And the difference primarily is that this tray on the left is polarizing visible range light in the blue and green and red, but not in the ultraviolet. Whereas the other tray, the metal bottom, is producing no polarized light in the visible range, but is polarizing light only in the ultraviolet. And so, and this is sort of some pond pictures showing they're all polarizing light. A natural pond polarizes light in that whole range. And so she exposed 3 species of of odonate, of dragonfly or damselfly to these treatments and let them decide whether they wanted to perch next to this type of treatment or the other one. And one of those three, this one called Sympetrum miliotum, that one preferred to spend more time. The picture is getting in the way, I'm sorry. But it exhibited more mating behaviors next to that polarized light treatment. And it also spent more time next to that in that polarized light treatment. And so this is an indication that that this dragonfly, at least, can see ultraviolet polarized light, and it uses it to locate water bodies. So let's see, how am I doing on time? I'm okay, but I should wrap it up pretty soon. So this polarized light pollution can occur, and as I mentioned, it leads to mortality and reproductive failure. And so we have some outstanding questions, and that is, is this leading to population problems of aquatic insects, or could this lead to declines or population sinks? And so there's a need to sort of eliminate evolutionary traps where they're occurring. And so this is something I've been exploring in some publications recently. And I'd just like to show you one last experiment that illustrates a way to do this and a possible mystery about how it works. So one way you could do this is to remove the attractive cue, the polarized light, and that's possible because really it's just shiny, rough things that polarize light. So this is some wet concrete that's both shiny and shiny. It's both wet and dry, and shiny and rough, or rough and smooth. And so, this is a way to eliminate polarized light from asphalt. You just add more gravel to it. You add more rock and you make it rougher, and then you can make it polarize less light. That's really simple. So you just make it more rough, and that removes the polarization, and the insects don't care anymore. Another interesting thing happened with a study that we did in 2009, and that was we bought these solar panels right here, and you can see they come with these little white borders around them, and you can see they're polarizing a lot of light. And we put these out next to a stream, and the aquatic insects completely avoided them, which was really weird. And then we went back to the lab and we covered the edges with a shiny white black tape, so the whole area was polarizing light, and suddenly the insects started being attracted again. It was really weird, and we don't know why. So we created an experiment that looked like this, where we created panels that were polarizing a lot of light, but only on the black parts, and we created artificial surfaces that had more and more higher density of these unpolarizing white strips, and then the insects could land on them and get stuck. So sort of looking at, the question we asked is sort of like, does adding more non-polarizing strips reduce the attraction, even though that black part is still polarizing light? And so what we found here is that if you divide up, if you only divide it in one, if you have one white strip, the insects are very well still captured at a high rate, even controlling for the surface area of the black polarizing area. And the more of these little dividers you add, the more 4 or 16 or 32, the insects start avoiding those treatments. So in other words, in these 3 different families of insects, this white non-polarizing gridding it sort of causes them to avoid what is clearly still very strong polarized light source, which is a mystery. And we did a quick follow-up study to this to see if, is it the line thickness too? Could thicker lines or more area lead to more repulsion? And I'm going to skip through this very quickly. And so those are some of the treatments we used. And we found that basically thickness also mattered. So insects avoided lines that were about 3 millimeters wide. And if you kind of, in all 4 of these groups here, so it was more important to have lines thicker to cause avoidance. This is the percent of captures drops off somewhere between the thin and the medium line, and that's about 3 millimeters wide in all these species. And when you combine these 2 studies together and put them on the same figure, what you see is something like this. Whether it's more lines or more area, it leads to less of the area being in the black. And the black part is the stuff that's sort of solar panels absorb the light. So whenever you lose area of a solar panel in black and you put it into these white pieces, it reduces the part that's gathering energy. And this shows you that if you reduce the area by about 2.5 or 3%, the insects are about 80% less attracted to it. So even a small reduction in this area leads to a massive reduction in attraction on solar panels, at least, which is interesting. But the weird part about this is that we still don't know why that's happening. We don't know why they avoid it. So these are some explanations for that. So one is maybe they're avoiding small patches of habitat, like the same way that birds avoid small forest fragments. Maybe small ponds are bad for reproduction. But even the biggest ponds in these experiments, the biggest patches are pretty small. They're like a foot wide, or quarter meter, 30 centimeters, 40. So that's not very big. So I wonder if reproduction could even happen in such a small pond. So that seems kind of unlikely. And the second hypothesis here that's still untested also is maybe what's happening with insects is that they have these compound eyes, and maybe what they're doing is just kind of averaging the amount of polarization in their visual field. So maybe they look at those surfaces we see and they go, okay, they're like, they're like lower, they're less polarized or more polarized on average, and not just looking at white versus black, but kind of collecting and averaging the whole area together. And that could be happening because when you look at natural water bodies, when the water bodies are moving fast and the water's going over rocks and getting kind of more frothy even, they get less polarized. So it could be that this could be a method that all these insects have all universally evolved for avoiding fast moving turbid water, and they're more attracted to smooth, slow water where they could lay their eggs, and maybe their eggs survive better in those areas. So this is still an open hypothesis, but it looks like it might be a general explanation for why this kind of thing, these little tricks we're playing to reduce attraction to solar panels, maybe that's why that works. So in terms of disarming traps, we can remove cues, we can add repulsive cues like fragmenting or adding non-polarizing parts to polarizing surfaces. And even it might even be possible to just move polarized light sources away from water bodies. We don't know. But we even see aquatic insects in the middle of the desert in California landing on solar panels. So, even some of these animals travel very long distances. So, in summary, we still don't know, it might be that polarized light pollution traps lead to population declines in insects, but we still don't know. We still don't know the relationship between the color or wavelength of light that's polarized and how that relates to maybe habitat conditions, like why do some insects use UV and some insects use visible light polarization? We don't know. But it might have implications for why, solar panel expansion, because it's a source of polarized light pollution. And we need new ways to eliminate traps. And we might figure that out by understanding how insects see things. So I know I talked a little bit quickly today, and I hadn't thought that maybe less material might be helpful to non-English speakers, non-native speakers, but I think many of you speak English too. I'm sorry if I spoke too quickly. So that's my talk for today. I hope you found it interesting, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Bruce. It was the time was good, and the English, even the speed was good. I mean, I got it completely. I hope the rest of us also did well with catching everything. But anyway, so thank you very much. So we're gonna take some questions, and I think somebody just typed something on the. Somebody said it was very interesting. So I think you got it.
Thank you, Paul.
So please, whenever, if any of you have a question, you can either type it or ask directly to Bruce. He's happy to take some questions. I mean, we have like 10 minutes, something like
At
that.
least. Yep.
Yep. So yeah, anyone? Well, I was going to ask you something, Bruce. So in that experiment with these panels that were subdivided into different sort of sections. So you have this first hypothesis, that the ones that says that possibly insects don't like these small patches, right? These small habitat patches. And I wonder, because some insects actually like that. I mean, for example, mosquitoes, mosquito females, they tend to, find these small places where they can lay their eggs, especially in houses, and especially like Aedes and related insects. And so I wonder whether, if that's the case, whether these patches, I mean, your experiment actually attracted those mosquitoes preferentially. I mean, if that's, because that would support your hypothesis, I would say.
Yeah, so our experiments weren't designed to test the patch size hypothesis, but that might be an explanation. We also did not catch any mosquitoes in our study. But your point in bringing up mosquitoes is an interesting one for many reasons. Mosquitoes are the one exception to the general rule that normally we see just across the board. Every insect that we've ever tested in my lab or anyone else's, higher polarized light means more attraction. But mosquitoes don't really always behave like that. And that's because they have other cues that they weigh very heavily as well. So they also, I think, can smell water. And they also have some other visual requirements. So they do use polarized light to locate water, and they absolutely do use very small patches sometimes, like even like a tiny puddle in a tire. But I don't think the only person who's done work on them is Amit Lerner in Ben Gurion University in Israel, and he hasn't done those kind of experiments yet. So it's a good point you bring up, and maybe it could be a way to test that hypothesis.
I mean, that goes to another thing that I was going to ask you, is like whether we know anything about how different insects, at least the different insects that you have found in your experiments, how they balance the different cues in order of priority in terms of like getting like the right decision, right? I mean, vision can be, of course, like a very important one, but then again, other and many others, whether these different insects differ in the weight that they have for these different cues when they are attracted to these different places, whether we know anything about that.
That's completely unknown, except for within the context of I think the only study that's ever been done to look at how polarized light is weighed with other cues is the study I mentioned. There's 2 studies by Amit Lerner with mosquitoes, and that's the only studies that have ever been done.
Okay, you have some questions already on the panel. So David has one. I mean, you can read it if you want.
Yeah. So the first one by David mentions that are there other cues that they could use, like chemical compounds? I think that's, again, sort of related to the only thing I think we know. It certainly could be, like scent and odor could not only attract animals to artificial polarizers, but it could also keep them away. If those, a solar panel doesn't smell like water or other things, then maybe that they wouldn't act as evolutionary traps, because the insects would see the cue, and then maybe at the last minute they would smell the panel and would go, okay, this smells bad, or it doesn't smell like water, and then they could leave. But no one knows.
And then you have another question by Lilia. She says in Spanish, I'm going to translate it. So would LED lights would be a good option for nocturnal traps, or even the regular ones, the I mean, the ones that we use. I think that's the question.
What would be a good option? I'm sorry.
Yeah, what would be a good option for nocturnal traps?
Oh, for just trying to catch insects at all?
I think so.
I think if you mean Lilia, if you mean that, like how would we try to make the strongest polarized light trap, then you would make like probably, I mean, the way I do it is I make a black painted tray, and then I put oil in it, and then that way when the insects touch it, they get stuck. And then I shine a light, I hang a light above it, and usually I'll use some broad spectrum light, but I've also done experiments where I'll use just one color of light, and so I can understand which color is more important for different species. I hope I answered your question.
And then you have Angelica's. She also has a question.
Okay. Thanks. It's a question related to non-polarized lines. Unpolarized lines work in general for all insects, or it depends on biology. It'd be the same for insects that occupy. Yeah, so that's a good question. So in other words, does the trick that we used on solar panels with the white lines that don't polarize, would that work for small and large insects, and insects with like larger insects, maybe like dragonflies, would have maybe larger area requirements in a habitat or for a patch to lay eggs in than maybe a small insect? That's a great question. I think that the experiments we did rarely, it's really neat that you guys are doing these dragonfly experiments, because that's the rarer type of experiment. And I think part of the reason is that maybe the experiment needs to account for the patch size that they need to be attracted to. Like maybe we need big test surfaces, or maybe it needs to be next to ponds like yours are. And I think that's totally unclear, I think, at this point, but it's a really good question.
Then you have Jesus. He has another question.
Do you think that some species that you studied could escape the trap by being more selective to some specific? That's a really good question, Jesus. Because evolutionary traps are supposed to be really bad for animals, really bad for individual animals, and really bad for populations, because you're literally doing the worst thing for your survival that you could. And so populations should collapse, but natural selection should also select very strongly against these organisms, these individuals that are attracted to the dangerous things, and start favoring individuals that make better decisions. And that might happen by using other cues. Like I can find water using the smell or the color. And I think there are examples in the literature of insects evolving, for example, to use, there's, for example, an example where a butterfly lays its eggs on an exotic plant, an exotic flower, but all the young die. And then somebody studied this for a long period of time, and the insects evolved to avoid the exotic host plant. So that can happen. But I'm not sure if it will happen in the polarized light system, because that polarized light system, there may not be another cue available. Polarized light is such a good cue to find water, and so unique and visible from a long distance. It may be that it's hard to evolve a new cue, and it may be that it's hard to evolve the loss of that cue. So I don't know, but it's a really good question.
I mean, I wonder whether, as you were saying, it's until like the insect makes contact with the surface that it can then use other cues to see whether that was like a good choice, right? Possibly.
Yeah, that seems possible. Like maybe maybe the evolution could lead to the use of polarized light at a distance, and then to find the pond, and then when you get close, you could smell it or touch it, and then you could avoid so that kind of thing could happen. That would be a really interesting idea to test.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how these different cues are being used along the sort of a transition from being just like attracted to until like the actual contact with the habitat, right? So
Thanks for asking that, Jesus. I would actually like to test that now. I really like that idea.
So Claudia has another question.
Oh, so it
Yeah.
says, are these adults ecological traps affecting adult insects only, or only larval stages? So far, only adults, because the adults are the only ones that are able to come out of the water, and then they need to find the water again. So, and then dragonflies, could these traps vary the longer they have lived in the city or closer living to buildings? This is, I think, if you mean like our insects in urbanized habitats more likely to experience traps, that seems very likely. They may also be more likely to evolve away from, out of the trap, but I don't know. Something we should.
Interestingly, though, with the dragonflies, I mean, we never mentioned that in the manuscript that we submitted, but there are some other species that were not attracted, you know.
Right.
So, you know, it makes you think whether they are using some of the cues, or whether, like, I don't know, whether they have learned because they have lived in this, you know, city for who knows how many generations, whether there has been like selection against that. I don't know.
Mm.
It's interesting also to see which insects do not fall in these traps. You know?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Siggy Stardust has a question for you.
What are the new applications to this that you could give us? Is there a way to reduce ecological traps? So you can see I wrote a paper that's a general paper called How to Disarm an Evolutionary Trap. I'd be happy to send that to you if you like. That's a general treatment. It talks about polarized light pollution in there. And, you know, ecological traps, there's probably, I think there's like 70 or 80 examples now. So there's clearly an emerging need to find ways to eliminate traps. So I think if you read that manuscript, you might kind of get a broader picture. Yeah.
Yeah, and Jesus says, thank you. Right, so any more questions? Well, in any case, Bruce and I have been discussing ways of like continuing with the research with the dragonflies that he showed. So if anyone is interested in joining this adventure with the dragonflies, please contact me or us. We would be happy to sort of discuss this with anyone who wants to do something with this, like for a, I don't know, like it could be like a good topic for a postgraduate dissertation possibly. And so please let us know if you're interested. I'm sort of also rushing because I don't know how your time is going.
I need to go in the next minute or two.
Right,
I have a class to teach.
Yeah, I know. So yeah, Bruce was very kind in giving us this time because he has to teach in a few minutes. Can you imagine? So thank you very much, Bruce. So we'll be in touch, obviously for other reasons. But thank you very much for presenting this wonderful talk.
Thank you very much for having me, Alex. It's really been wonderful to get to know you and your students. And thank you all for your attention. I really appreciate the nice questions.
Thanks, everyone. Gracias a todos. I'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you. Bye now.